basically book 7 was describing the prerequisites and the trajectory to get to this perfect state. And moving to book 8, that state will be held into comparison with all the inferior states. Maybe it's nice to hold this in context of that we're doing this to figure out whether a righteous individual is the one pursuing his own goals, or whether the righteous individual is the one that's basically self-sacrificial so that it can hold up a higher structure, and thereby be ridiculed. That is the implication. So it's a sacrifice of time, energy, and attention, but also of honor, money, all that stuff. So yeah. Did I see the pattern of what they were talking about last week? Not really. Not really. I have been expanding my vision because, well, like we're gonna see in book 8, there's a sequential nature to cycles. I think I've been getting more aware of the sequential nature in cycles, and in some sense how they affect you, and I guess you got to know it first to see how you participate in them. But that's definitely something fruitful that I'm exploring myself. So the one that I was thinking about was going through hope, faith into love, and what the different factors are that influence that process, and how you need to attend to them so that you can, well, evolve, right? Like it's orient you towards something, and like you have the proper orientation, and how do you conform to that orientation. So that's kind of where my mind is. Yeah, so last time I was looking for other ways to explain the dialectic. This time I want to find out what is going on. like why did he choose to write this down? Like, fair enough, but like there's some point being made that I'm not seeing yet. So I would like that to appear. Manuel, I'll pass it over to Danny, whose previous intentions were to practice looking at how other people understand dialectic, and practice listening.
So I guess a theme, I mean, when I was reading the text, that I was just meditating on why am I pursuing what I'm pursuing, because themes in this, number one is that perfection is fleeting, or life is fleeting, and there's cyclical nature to, there's times and seasons for pursuing different things, and that's kind of what I was meditating on as I was reading this text. So I mean I've been thinking about that a lot. Right now motivations change over time. Right now I have a ton of demands and a lot of obligations on my time, and many of which I would rather not have to be doing. So just being able to reconcile and do the things that I have to do the best that I can, just at a high level, is just trying to see. Number one, I don't quite get what Plato is trying to say. Again, like, why did he write this down? But that's what I'm searching for. I'm searching for insight. I'm seeing lots of relationships to where I am in time and space, and and how, with respect to external circumstances. So just trying to guard my time, energy, attention, and make sure that it's being allocated as best as I can. Mark?
Yeah, so I didn't quite finish the chapter, which was unfortunate, or the book. I thought I was going to, but I got up late. But I like that we're back to a much simpler conception, right? There's no obvious, statement of an analogy or a metaphor in here. We're back to very plain speak, and the absurdity, the pattern of absurdity in the text is clear. It's so glaringly clear. And that dichotomy that's set up in the beginning between the mathematical way, or we would probably call it a scientific way of dealing with a problem. In this case, the problem of creating a just city, or getting at the problem of justice, and we would call it a religious way, right, with the muses, is set up quite nicely, right? It's crystal clear. There's no interpretation necessary. There's nothing in this book to interpret. All very plain. You can disagree with a bunch of it, right? And again, a lot of it's absurd, but I thought that was very interesting. So I'm interested to see what other people found in here, because man, you can breeze right past some sort of whopping statements, and you could also get caught up on some whimsy, because there's quite a bit of whimsy in this, in at least in the first half of book 8 here. Over to Ethan, I guess.
Yes. Yes.
Or not, if he doesn't want to talk to us anymore.
Sorry, guys. We've got some company over today, so my participation will be not as much as it usually is.
You have company all the time, dude. I have a little guy.
I have that too, yes.
Okay. Well, let's get this go. Mark, what was your intention?
I mean, for this chapter, for this particular book, I mean, I just wanted to see what everybody was seeing in it.
Mm-hmm. Explore. Okay. So, did you want to go over some stuff in book 7 still, Mark? Because I think we kind of finished it.
Well, we sort of read through the last portion of it. Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth just sort of recapping where 7 leaves off, right? Because it does set up at the end. I mean, I know again we read it, but we really didn't. We just read it. Like, we didn't really talk about it, which is fair enough. We're sort of running low on time for that one. But it does talk about, and this is gonna. I didn't know this obviously, but this is gonna become relevant in this one. It does talk primarily about child rearing. Those last few pages that we read are all about, the child and what they're going to be disposed to do, whether or not things are fair, right? And it's all about, an outlaw from having been a law-abiding man, right? So it's interesting that they sort of set that up, right? And then say, look, city, regime, prayers, right? Uh, you know, older than 10, right? Like, I mean, it's all about child rearing and the relationship to child rearing in that city, which is interesting because the first part of 7 is not about that. But then he picks that up in 8, not right away. So I thought that was worth pointing out, because there is a continuation of that theme, but it's not immediate. It's later on in the in the book.
Well, actually, it's not only child rearing, right? It's the whole cycle of the individual, right? And after you're 50, then you're supposed to rule, right? And like he also goes into the cycles of the individuals, right? Like, oh, so you had this childhood trauma, and therefore you attend or worship. That's the word that they're using in my book. You worship these things, And because you're worshipping these things, you become this person. And he goes through the trajectory, right? But what's the distinction between the perfect city? Because he doesn't go into the perfect city, right? So in some sense, you can say at least the end of book 7 is the beginning of book 8.
Right.
And what's the distinction? In the perfect city, you have the two architects that guide the process, right? And in all the other cities, you just have the process happen within its natural conditions, right? And then corruption seeps in as a consequence of not having everything perfect.
Right. Well, and it's worth pointing out right here in the beginning, right? You were presenting your arguments. This is 543C. You were presenting your arguments pretty much as you are doing now, as though you had completed your description of what concerns the city, saying you would class a city such as you then described, and the man like it as good. And you did this, as it seems, in spite of the fact that you had a still finer city and man to tell of. And so I just want to point that out, because they're not describing one city, right? They're on a quest to describe an ever more just city as a way of getting at justice. This is the description of the city is a means to get at justice, because the thesis in the beginning of the text is you cannot arrive at justice by talking about individuals, either single individuals or individuals in relationship to one another. That is insufficient. It somehow lacks a depth, if you want to go there, that a city has, where, as we established in book 7, like it or not, there are different classes of people who have different limitations on what they can see and do. Like, that's what book 7 is about, the fact that there are classes of people and that they are limited, and that the higher classes need to be forced to help the lower classes. They're not better by result of going towards the good. They're better by the result of being forced down away from the good and then allowed to go back up. That's what makes them better. It's that cycle. And so that establishing of that cycle too is going to be super relevant here in book 8, but it's explicit here that we've been building cities up, having a better conception in mind all along, or at least that's the claim here, right? And then going with the better conception. And so this isn't a story of how to build one perfect city. That is not what is going on here.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple things that popped up for me. So one is like the justice of what is just is unfolding, right? Like it's a manifest as a consequence of the manifestation of the city. And the second thing, oh man, like I is I think what is just might actually also be contingent upon the city that you're in, because of what is available to you, right? Like what are you capable of reaching, right? Because he's literally saying, right, like if you're not in this situation, then you're effectively constrained from participating in the being of the good, right? So like what is just if you cannot participate in the being of the good? Well, it's got to be something else than participating in the being of the good, or it's just totally inaccessible to you.
Right. And again, that's established in book 7. Like, that's contrary to what everyone's told you. That's what the quote parable of the cave is. It is the statement that you are a limited creature and you're limited by your birth, by what you were born into. And they don't just mean the part of the city or the parents that you have, they mean your limitations as a being. Right? That's what the cave is about. Your physical, material limitations, and not just your material limitations, but primarily your material limitations as a being. And you're right, that theme is extended here.
Right, and in some sense, right, they're taking everything else, right, which is not necessarily a constraint upon you, right, and that's what they're perfecting, right. So this is, I guess, the nature versus nurture, right, and they're just saying like, okay, like this aspect of nature, and then there's an aspect of nurture, and you need to combine them in such a way that, well, justice emerges, I guess. So, yeah, so to get to this just state, and we're talking about the humor and things, and well, we can say maybe the first part is also a joke. It's like, okay, we have the complete removal of individuality, right? We create a complete dependence upon the state, and we inspect the defects or imperfect forms, right? So in some sense, it's like, okay, we're gonna remove all variability, and then we're gonna sieve everything so that we can place it at the right place. Like that's the way that their road to perfection starts, which is the most tyrannical thing you can do ever. Which is kind of reminding me of how communism started. Like we're just gonna do the things, like implement the system, and then we're gonna work out the kinks. Then they divide.
Do we want to talk about the 4 regimes that turn into
the
5?
the 5, or are they 4?
Well, no, he says, I want to hear what 4 regimes you meant.
4 other regimes, right?
Well, it doesn't say on
Yeah.
here, but yeah, 5 ultimately.
Right.
Yeah. Well, they said, I think if I remember correctly, they'll say that the ideal city doesn't, it may exist at one, it's possible for it to exist at a certain point in time in the universe, but it's not likely for us to see it.
The
Remember that.
The aristocracy is the resurrection of what they talked about in book 4 and 5. So they say, remember what we talked about in book 4 and 5? We're going to start there. We already talked about that, and then they move on and say, let's talk about the 4 others.
Oh, it's not the
They've got-
perfect city, the aristocracy?
No, it is. I mean, I
No.
think that's how I read
Okay.
it.
No.
Well, go ahead.
Well, you have the one with the philosopher king, and then these 4 cities in book 8. One's a timocracy. The second one is an oligarchy. The third one is a democracy, and the fourth one is a tyranny. And he compares the timocracy to Sparta, and says that it's probably the best instantiation of a polis that we've seen.
And Crete. He also compares it.
Oh, does he? Okay.
Well, it's Crete and Laconian regimes.
So I looked it up, right? So cracy is, I think, force or something, or power, or like no. And the tim means honor. So basically, what it is an honor culture.
Honor culture, yeah, right.
Yeah.
Democracy and honor culture.
Yeah, it's interesting because their ideals, the things that they're orientated to, fall with each degree of city. Honor is something, instead of the good, it's honor, and then after honor, it ultimately ends in individualism, which is where democracy, individualism peaks at democracy and then ends with tyranny, because it's just the will to power at that point.
So yeah, it is interesting, because, well, let's just go there, I guess. I don't have to precede the book. Let's say corruption is universal. Governments vary with the disposition of man. They mirror each other. Humans are the agent, and then there's 5 constitutions that are mirroring the 5 states, which, as far as I got into the book, I don't know if I really got names for these constitutions yet. Like, they're not too clear to me. So we have described aristocracy, we'll do a comparison. And so they start with the description of the state, and then they do the description of the individual, right? So in some sense, they're they're going back to the layers of the onion, right? Like first we started with the individual, then the state, and now they're going from the state to the individual, right? It's descending back into the argument, and maybe that's why this is here, right? Like maybe that's just the justification for the whole book, that like they need to dress the individual in the city, and that's the way that you're going to make the argument for justice.
Yeah, well, you have to tie it back pragmatically. You just can't start there and leave it there, which is the argument in the beginning. And also, it's worth noting that pattern, which is in the book in multiple areas, right? It's a fractal, it's a self-similar fractal pattern in the book. That pattern of ascension and descension, right? Which is, oh, Neoplatonism. No, it's just Plato. It's not Neoplaton, it's just Plato. That pattern is probably part of the confusion around Plato's cave. That doesn't happen in Plato's cave, but it does happen in the books, in the text, right? In other places.
And I would argue that is dialectic. Like that's literally the dialectic.
You're saying the dialectic is moving up and down the issue?
Yes.
I'm okay with that as long as
I think the whole book is the dialectic about justice.
Yeah, and I would call it a circumambulation rather than use the term dialectic.
Yeah, no, but the circumambulation doesn't have to go up, right? Like that's the problem, right? Because dia means true, right? Like the dia means true.
We don't have a good way to think about it.
And I need what's
right, because when you read what dialectic means, it's one thing, but then when you look at, say, a diagram of dialectic, it's always like a couple of things. It's always a state change between A and B, or multiple state changes between A and B, which is wrong. There's a few exceptions. And I think that's the problem with the modern conception, is people put dialectic in opposition and call it opponent processing or some other stupid thing that doesn't exist. And then they proceed from there, and that is an error. That's not what's in this text at all. Like that's just you're mistaken.
So
oversimplifying something.
The art of conversing, or relating to the art of reasoning about probabilities. Like that's the oldest one that I can find.
Yeah, the art of investigating or discussing the truth of opinion.
Which is kind of what Socrates is doing, right? Because at a certain point he says, "Well, yeah, like I don't know if I'm relating to the form anymore. Like all you got is my opinion at this point."
Right, but definition number 2 is inquiry into the metaphysical, no such thing. Contradictions, no such thing, and their solutions. See, so everybody strays into this binary mode for dialectic. It's not a binary. It's not supposed to be a binary. Clearly not a binary. Stop with the freaking binary. That isn't what's going on, right? And yeah,
Wikipedia it's right. What they're doing is they're doing undressing while Plato is dressing.
Yes, well, they're oversimplifying something so that I don't. Yeah, I don't understand why we have this. And it's very sharp. Either people have a reasonable, full opening definition of dialectic, or they're stuck in this Hegelian binary that's obviously incorrect and refuted by literally every single thing Plato wrote. I don't know what to say about that, other than duh, let's stop doing that.
Is it just materialistic framing? Is that the problem? Because they can't see the vertical causality?
I don't know, Ethan. I mean, this was what we went over in the live stream last night to some extent, right? What causes the flattening? And I think I don't think it matters to some extent. It could be that. It could be it. It could also just be people want to understand dialectic and they're
Well,
dumb and they
doesn't
can't, and so they cast it as a binary. I mean, that's what Hegel did. Clearly,
doesn't
that's what Hegel did.
doesn't Plato say that you have to wait till you're like 35?
Yes. Yes, he does.
So, right, like this is just dialectic presented to kids. It's like, okay, like
Right.
that's all
Right.
it is. It's like, oh, you're doing something that you're not ready for. Good luck. I think it leads to materialism, right? Because if you think you are capable of dialectic, while you're obviously not doing it, then you end up in a flat world.
Yeah. Well, like I said, the causality is really hard to determine. Is it you're squishing the world because you're trying to understand the whole thing like a moron because you can't, or is it some, is it the explanation that you're being given, right? Or is it your attempt to understand Plato and then you misapprehend everything he's saying? And and this idea of age being a requirement for enough wisdom to rule is set right down in the United States government, right? You have to be so old to be president.
Well, it's even worse, right? It's not only a constraint of age, right? It's constraint of age under a set education for
Right.
specific natures. Like there's way more constraints than the age.
Exactly. Exactly. Right. And there's a richness there that we lose when we cast things, when we flatten the world or cast them into binaries. And this is very much exemplifying that. Like this is very, very, well, it's either this or this, right? Oh yeah, absolutely. It's like, come on, it's so silly. It's awesome. It's completely hysterical, but they are exemplifying that fact here. So I find it ironic that the very thing they're poking fun of with the structure of the book throughout every part of the text is also the mistake everybody's falling into and not realizing. I just,
Right, and
the irony is delicious.
I actually think that if you take book 8 and you look at all the phases, right? And because I think he's also mentioning the constraint of relating to virtue, right? Or cultivating virtue, right? So every stage gets further away from virtue because it's basically not worshipped anymore. And if you don't have the cultivation of virtue and you still participate in the dialectic, right? Like then you get sophistry, right? And I mean, if we're talking about Plato making fun of people, right, or Socrates or both, the part of the book is basically saying, well, these people are trying to do dialectic without having a wholesome vision of what they're doing dialectic in, and then they end up regressing, right? Like they can't ascend, right? They can't go up into what was the realm of intelligibility or whatever. And they have to go down to the realm of shadows, right? Like that's basically what they have to do. And I also think that there's some references there. So maybe that's a good way of understanding, right? And in that sense, it's a warning and maybe a way to classify the person that you're dealing with, because like what kind of appeals can you make to a person, right? Like if they're stuck in this value system, they're gonna have certain affordances for attending to aspects of the world, and other things are closed off just as a virtue of their worship, right? So if you want to upgrade them, right, you have to give them one step, right? Like this was the thing with Glaucon, right? Like Glaucon was always the guy who was lowest, right? And they have to lift them up like one step, and then at a certain point it's like, dude, you can't go here anymore. Like this is beyond you. Like this is forbidden knowledge.
Poor Glaucon.
Yeah, no, he's not a poor guy. He can beat them all with a sword fight. Like anyway,
It reminds me of like Reminds me of like a bunch of little girls playing house, you know, when they're kids, or like a bunch of little boys playing philosophy, like sandbox philosophy or something.
Yeah, well, it's basically building a house, right? Just building a really complicated house. So, yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I think, and there are some good people talking about philosophy, and to that end, I'll just mention Lantern Jack. My buddy Lantern Jack had another chat with John Vervaeke. They just released it on YouTube like an hour ago.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, why Stoicism and Platonism, right, are capturing the hearts of millennials, and
Yeah.
well, they're gonna run into a lot of trouble there.
How'd he get away with not putting the Neo there before the
Jack's
Platonism?
channel, and he's no
Yeah.
fool.
Oh,
Jack and I get along for a reason, and we have a lot of agreement about misinterpretation of philosophy. And we'll say he totally agrees with me about the value of so-called modern philosophy. It's all garbage. They're all sophists, and he's not
yeah.
impressed with any of them. And he
I
doesn't
re-
want to be associated with them, even though he has a PhD in philosophy.
yeah, I remember that in one of his podcasts. He like did a survey, and he asked everybody at all these universities, like, have we learned anything new since the Republic? And everyone's like, no.
No.
It's like, what are you doing? What? Who's paying you?
Well, he also asked them, what do you the heads and some quite famous people, uh, you know, are what do you think about truth? And they're like, no, we don't believe in there's a truth out there. And he's like,
Oh, yeah, yeah, because it's in their occupational interest for there not to be a truth. Wow, that sounds dangerous.
right, well, but also he said, you do understand that everybody who's not in a philosophy department at a university thinks that's what you're doing, right? And they're like,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
And it's like, wait,
This
what?
is, it's like,
We're paying them to
that's
search for truth and they're not doing it.
yeah. It
I'm
seems,
just saying.
kind of smells like a little bit of evil to me, honestly.
Well, it is like
It is.
but yeah, maybe we can classify them while we're going through these these stages. But like,
Well, that pattern
yeah,
is here.
like they probably fit in the democracy or in the tyranny. Like
Somewhere in there, yeah.
No, they fit in the democracy that leads to the tyranny. Yeah, I would argue that it has to be that class that is causing these problems. And when we have, we'll say, more of a republic in the United States, anyway, things were much better. Now that we've moved more towards a democracy, things are much worse.
Well, yeah, I mean, not to drift at all, but it seems like with the constituents being able to like we're able to like see a lot more of what our elective representatives are doing, and so we're allowed to make more judgments on them, which are inappropriate, like judgments that shouldn't be made. I don't like
no. Well, yeah, I don't think we can. Like,
Yeah, but no, but we are, right? And that's a problem. But then the problem that they bring up here about democracy is basically that all democracy leads to hedonism. It's basically what it says.
Mhm. Yeah,
Necessarily. That's why being a democratic republic is really important and being a democracy is really bad. And we know this. Like, this is the fun. It's been tried, it failed. We know why it failed. It's been tried many times, it's failed many times. It's failed for the same reasons every time. Maybe that's
yeah.
because it can't ever work. Like, I don't know. Like, at what point do you say, hey, maybe I'm wrong and democracy can't work and republics are good? Democratic
Who
republics are
fool?
kind of the best mix we've found so far, and there's a lot of evidence
but
that that's
Mark,
true.
that's the problem because now we have populism, and populism is destroying the democracy.
Oh yeah, well, yeah, we
It's like
gotta.
what you don't want populism, but you want democracy. What I don't like what
No, no,
seems
No
like
like
different.
those.
like the populism is the democracy turning towards itself, effectively, right? It's like, okay, democracy, you're not serving me. I'm gonna
Right.
use you to subvert your trajectory. Like that's basically what it is.
Populism is merely the statement that it's democracy that is not proceeding as you wish. Right. In other words, oh, not this democracy. I don't want people voting this way. I thought they would vote a different way.
No,
And
well,
that's
So it
all it is.
sounds like it's shifting from democracy to tyrant, and you just happen to not be the tyrant. Somebody else is.
yeah,
You're
but
shifting it to tyranny because you don't like the result of the democracy. That's actually what's
Yeah.
happening.
Oh, okay.
That's what
Yeah. Yeah.
that's literally what's happening. That's why in the United States it's only on one side. And they don't like that. They don't like hearing that. They don't like seeing it in themselves, but it's actually only on one side.
Mm-hmm.
but that's why it's related to progressivism, right? Because like if you're progressing, right, and your progression gets subverted, then now that's an existential threat. I don't know what else to say. Like, yes, they're
That's
right.
true.
It is
an
an existential threat.
threat.
And
Yes.
this was the problem with Napoleon as well, right? Like when he started to introduce the nation state, right? Like now, if you're at war, you get an existential threat. Like it's the same with Putin. Like everybody's scared to do something against Putin because if it's an existential threat, then like who knows what he's gonna do, right? And before that, it wasn't like that because people were civilized.
Yeah.
Well, and they could be civilized again if they negotiate. It's this lack of right. And so in a democracy, if the democracy is not going your way, you negotiate. You don't call it populism and then fight against the thing that you said you liked, which is democracy. But that's what's happening, right? When you call it populism, you're identifying against the democracy, right? You've created an alternate democracy, which isn't a democracy, obviously. And now you're using that alternative thing to other the people in the democracy that are just voting the way you didn't expect, basically.
Yeah.
And
It's like
that's
literally.
what's
It's
happening
literally how he. It's literally how he explains how it switches from democracy to
to
tyranny.
tyranny. Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Right. And it's through this idea of populism. Whether you call it populism or not, it's through the idea
Mm-hmm.
of populism. The people
Yep.
invoking populism are the tyrants or
But
will become them.
but
It's that easy.
like that problem already exists in the oligarchy, right? Like he talks about you cannot arm the people because there's a dichotomy between the people and those that rule them, and because they're
Well,
effectively
but that's
oppressive.
not a problem, and that's not the same problem. In order to instantiate a tyranny, you need to disarm the population. The only reason to disarm the population is to instantiate a tyranny. There are no other reasons. They don't. Other reasons don't exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting if you. I like the comparison of the polis and then down to the soul, and because the soul is the person, um, which is a combination of what body, soul, mind, whatever, is a microcosm of the world, right? And as things are, as you orientate yourself not towards virtue and goodness, you orientate yourself towards lower and lower and lower things until alcoholism takes over your entire life, or whatever. What's it called when you're addicted to sex? I forget what it's called, but yeah, drugs, whatever. That's the equivalent of a tyranny, is when you become orientated towards the things at the bottom, and then they end up ruling over your entire life and end up killing you. Because that's another point that he makes, is like tyranny lasts like a day. I mean, not literally a day, but it doesn't last very long at all before everything just implodes or collapses.
Yeah, let's go through the thing. So we start with the government of honor, and this is the point that maybe someone has more insight upon, but it arises from aristocracy, right? The government of the best. Um, so why is he doing that, right? Like why is he going back from aristocracy and scaling down the ladder? Like, is this just for symmetry? Because like obviously that cannot be, because like there's these governments in existence, right? He's referencing them, and like there wasn't any perfect aristocracy that they could come from.
Well, that's not true. I mean, they did come from an Aristotle. It wasn't perfect. He's not talking about perfection. So
Did they come from aristocracies?
Yeah, aristocracies are self-generating. Right? Once you're in the aristocracy, you're in. Like you don't. It's self-perpetuating because it's based on birth.
So when I was reading
that-
through this, I had two questions on my mind throughout the entire time. And one, I was like in 544, they kind of introduced their evaluative criteria, which is are they happy? Or in other words, what's the state of their soul? And then the second question I was thinking about was what are the people preoccupied with? What are their motivations? What's their conception of the good? What's their fundamental value? So throughout the whole system, I was thinking about those two things. In an aristocracy, everything's harmonious, everything's cool, right? And then as they move into the democracy, where they have the honor culture, that's the highest good, that's the conception of the good, that's the highest value, and they neglect the muses. So then, what is the effect on the state of the soul when you're in that state? That's how, and then you can proceed throughout the rest of. And so the way I was thinking about this was through the model of their Greek model of the soul, the head, the heart, and the belly, or the rational, the spirited, and the appetitive, which roughly map onto the ruling class, the soldier class, and the working class. And so, yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, but
get the-
Danny, I don't think they talk about the soul at that point because they don't introduce the muses until 547b. Right. In other words, they set all this stuff up in the first, what is this, two or three pages here, right? And then they use what I would call the scientific, or more correctly, mathematical Pythagorean frame. And they go on that big, long, ridiculous, totally hysterical rant. That's just like one blob of text. It's just absolute genius. And then they say, basically, yeah, that ain't gonna work. We're gonna have to go with the muses. Which just, again, I'm sorry. It's just too funny because nobody mentions it. We're gonna have to go with the muses, guys. And then they go with the
But I think they referenced the
Where is this?
muses before that as well, actually.
I don't maybe.
It's
I
in
don't
book
I
4 and
didn't see it.
5. I mean, they it's. I mean, they're just
No,
resurrecting.
in book 8,
no.
I mean.
We're talking about book 8. Like, this is where people get confused, right? If you start jumping books all over the place, then the next thing you know, the whole thing's about Plato's cave, and it most certainly is not. Like,
Here,
this is where people get confused.
at the end of 45D, it says, in what way then will our city be moved, and in what manner will the two classes of auxiliaries and rulers disagree among themselves or with one another? Shall we, after the manner of Homer, pray the muses to tell us how discord first arose?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the setup. Like they're trying to explain discord. Shall we imagine them
Well,
in solemn mockery? So that's interesting. So he's already. And
yeah,
to
I have.
play and jest with us as if we were children, and address us in a lofty, tragic vein, making believe to be in earnest. Which
Well-
is a serious play, by the way. There you go.
I think before that, it's even more explicit before that in 545c when he says, "We will compare with this the like character in the individual, and after that consider oligarchy and the oligarchical man, and then again we will turn our attention to democracy and the democratical man, and lastly we'll go and view the city of tyranny, and once more take a look at into the tyrant's soul." That's what my translation says. And try to achieve a satisfactory decision. But they talk about the character of man. They use other words like the character of man, and they use a bunch of different words to get at the same thing.
Yeah, you're right, Danny. But so he's talking about the tyrant soul because he's wanting to compare it with the righteous soul.
Well,
right?
Right, but he's saying we're going to do this. They don't do it yet. That was my point. My point is, again, they're following this format of staying in the strictly material in the beginning. So yes, they're referencing the muses and the soul. I totally agree. But they're not talking about that yet. They have to go through the material and destroy it the way they did in book 7 and all the previous books. Here's the limitations, constraints, and the reason why the material frame doesn't work. And for the material frame in this instance, right after all the stuff you're talking about, right in 546, they use the Pythagorean outline, this very geometric mathematical outline. And it's one big blob of text. And then they say, that doesn't work. let's go to the Muses. And now, John, to the Muses, right? Like it's we're gonna hand it off to the studio and the Muses. It's it's completely hysterical in my mind. It's just funny. So
Oh, but
it's not that they don't mention it, it's that they are actually not talking about it. They're referencing it, fair, but they're not talking about it, which is different.
so since Adam joined us, we were making a reference to the honor cultures, effectively, right, or the democracies in Crete and in Sparta. So we have some context for us there.
I have Laconia, by the way, not Sparta. Just
Yeah, Laconia is largely, or the Lacedaemonians. All of these are basically referred to by referring always to the Spartans, and I think also partially related. Anyways,
right, but that's the Spartan Empire.
yes,
Right.
right. So that
the
would
Helots
include,
are
for instance,
Laconians. The
yeah,
Helots
and the
are Laconians,
Argives,
but
the
not
Argives,
Spartans.
yeah,
Right. Okay.
the oh, I forget their name, Skiritai, which are a special branch of the Spartan army.
Yeah, there's like four different countries or cultures or whatever
Yeah.
in Laconia, but they're all ruled by Sparta, by the democracy.
Yeah, yeah. So the Cretans as well, to give context for the Cretans, as far as I recall, the Spartans are very much involved in Crete a lot of the time. Actually, they tend to try and invade Crete, which is a bit weird. Crete, interestingly, out of all the Greek islands, is the one that seemed to retain most ancient influence of like the Mycenaeans. That's why, and I had the oldest kind of civilization closest to the Greek mainland, apart from Anatolia on the other side. And the Spartans, well, the Spartans are largely the Spartans. The honor culture of the two, I would say that they would be the most likely to have anything approaching what we might call an honor culture in comparison with the other ancient Greek city-states. It's not that you couldn't insult somebody and somebody wouldn't try and defend their honor in Athens or something like that, but I think that the honor culture also goes hand in hand with how martial they are as a people, because the Spartans, the homoioi, which is the warrior class of Sparta, what we call Spartans proper, I mean, they'd fight you, right? Similarly with the Cretans, an Athenian citizen probably wouldn't be so, it wouldn't be a clear-cut case whether he'd fight you or not, in terms of if you insulted his honor or something like that. So that's as much as I can think of to say on it at the moment. I mean, what was the context of the democracy thing, anyways? What were they?
Well, it's supposed to emerge out of aristocracy. So that's my next question. Is there any examples of an aristocratic government in Greece?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, well, the Spartans would be considered an aristocratic government. But then there would also be something like Thebes, Corinth. Corinth was in the league, in the same league with Sparta. Yeah, most of the Thebes certainly is a good example of a very aristocratic city. Unlike the Athenians, they didn't really have much in the way of like public participation in how things were being run in the city, at least not in the way that the Athenians had with their pottery shards. So yes, so that and how that relates to democracy, yeah, I don't know. I guess that's given in the text, but there are many examples. In fact, I think in general among the Doric peoples, like Syracuse is also a good example of an aristocratic one. I think all the colonies that tended to be founded by Sparta or Corinth tended to be aristocratic in nature. Whereas the ones founded by the Ionians, that is the Athenians, this is in reference to the dialect of ancient Greek they spoke. They tended to be more, let's say, democratic, in the sense that the Greeks know democracy, which is not how most people refer to it nowadays. You know, there was property requirements, etc.
So what's the reason that you think that those colonies went aristocratic? Like, is it because they didn't have the responsibility of the military aspect, or like?
The aristocracy generally would have been the military, apart from maybe a couple of crafts, like apart from like the aristocracy not so much would have been the military, but would have led the military.
Well, and that's how colonies were founded. I think the people that found them rule them. It's not a super secret magical. It's like, oh, we made this city. You know, you people who live here are now beholden to the family. Okay.
Yeah. That's how a lot of the colonization happened, especially for the really easy colonial endeavors, i.e., like, you know, Sicily or Turkey, or the northern part or the southern part of the Black Sea. That's basically, you could think of them as mostly business ventures, probably started off by a couple of families, a couple of wealthy families in the city that decided, we don't want to really live here anymore. There's space elsewhere.
Right. Well, and you can look at that and mistake it for an emergence is good or bottom up process, but that's wrong. Like the not anybody could and did wander into that area and start a city. That didn't happen. It wasn't random people wandering into an area starting a city. That's never happened, probably in history, right? What has happened is people had a vision from above, and then they enacted that vision, and that is what makes them the aristocracy. The people who have the vision to build the city and actually do the work to make it happen are the aristocracy because they put in the work. So it's not a secret magic formula where you're born into the family and therefore. It actually starts with a vision that comes down upon you of something in the future that could be manifest. It's not like, oh, people wandered into this area and there was a river, so they settled down and built a city. No, lots of people did that, and none of them built the city until the people we now call the aristocracy did it. And that's why they're not the random other emergent people that wandered into the area, because those people didn't build the city.
Yeah. Oh, it's useful to note as well that your position as a Spartan, just to go back to Spartan and how they're actually a really good example of an aristocratic government, because of the fact that to be a Spartan, to be what's called part of the homoioi, otherwise known as the similars, it was a hereditary position essentially. And there were property requirements as well, but it had to be hereditary. That was the main thing that made sure you would be a Spartan. That's why there were plenty of other people in the Spartan society who had just as much money as the Spartans, but never were allowed to call themselves Spartans and serve in their particular military structure. They were called parioikoi. They were always treated as foreigners, as non-citizens, even though they were the craftsmen and all of that, right? So that's Sparta is actually Sparta would have been the example of aristocracy that everyone in that dialogue would have been thinking of. Actually, right? Yeah, because this is happening around the time of the Peloponnesian War, and there's this coming to loggerheads between Athens and Sparta. When they refer to aristocracy there, you can basically, in their minds, they're thinking more broadly as well, but more importantly, their concrete example is those Spartans over there. Those are that's aristocracy.
So in the end, the people fighting us.
Oh,
How much commonwealth was
Hey.
there in those societies? Because in Plato, in 547b, which is a little bit ahead, when they talk about how discord is introduced, remember in the Republic, you have like everybody sharing all the property, and I think even the wives and stuff, but everybody's sharing a bunch of stuff. And then discord comes in when you have two races which are drawn different ways. The iron and brass starts acquiring money, land, houses, gold, and silver. And then you have another class of people who don't want money, but have true riches in their own nature. inclined towards virtue in the ancient order of things. So he introduces this idea of the division of what's motivating these people. How much common, how much commonality in material things was there in those societies? And because he mentions property, so the first thing he mentioned was that the property gets split up into individual owners, and then he talks about implications about what that has. Were there private property rights?
No, they're traders. Yeah, it's all private.
Yeah,
property.
it's going to be.
It's all private property.
Property rights are going to be. The difference would be among the Spartans. Again, I'm pretty sure all the land is. I think all the land is owned by the Spartan state technically, and then leased out to the Spartans themselves. I'm not quite sure about that, but what I am sure of, in relation to something like that in Sparta, is that when the Spartans were being trained, the barracks that they inhabited, it was all common property. So
Right.
and they all had to pay for the upkeep of the barracks, every single one of them, and they had to
Right.
do everything related to that.
The irony here, and what nobody I've ever heard talk about this particular text ever mentions, is that almost all of the description of this wonderful city with the guardians is describing Sparta, almost to a T.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Public
Yeah,
property,
I think so.
training, right? And the difference in and it's clearly meant to be funny and not serious, is that men and women are equal in Athens, and they wouldn't be in Sparta.
Oh, yeah. I forgot to mention. Did we mention this before about the whole, like, the way the Greeks view, or the way the rest of the Greeks viewed the Spartans, and the fact that they viewed the Spartans as giving their women too much reign, because property was not transmitted through the father to his son. It was transmitted from the mother to her children in
Right.
Spartan society only, not in any of the other ancient Greek society.
Oh, that's actually, isn't that kind of related to the Jews, right? But
Yeah, the Jews do something similar.
Yeah, I think so.
because the Jews, they got their land assigned by God, right? And then it was supposed to stay in the family, right? So there's this higher power that bestows the land, and then, like, you can sell it, but then you get it back again, right? There's this being bound to the land. So
Well, and you're Jewish by your mother, not by your father.
Mhm.
yeah, I don't
Yeah.
know where that came from actually. Like,
Well, it doesn't matter. The point is, yeah, there's this difference in Sparta because the women own property. Like, that's why whenever women were never allowed to own property in the ancient, like, I can give you thousands of examples where you're wrong. You're just flat out wrong. In every single culture, at least one period of time that lasted a very long time, women had property transfer rights. It's just this fantasy that wasn't the case, and that the patriarchy is a real concept is a fantasy, and you shouldn't believe a word of it.
And in regards to the females owning property, like, there's a whole genre. In fact, Plutarch, this is a man writing 150 AD, right? He has part of his parallel lives. He has On the Sayings of the Spartans, and then On the Sayings of the Spartan Women. So obviously there was an impression even made into hundreds of years later, 600 years, almost 1,000 years after after the Peloponnesian War, after kind of this time period, where people were viewing the Spartans as this weird kind of, not as fully egalitarian, but like really kind of weird in terms of how they view men, or how they're treating men and women in their societal structure. I mean, it's the classic line from 300, which is taken, I think, from that list of sayings, where it's basically like, something like, why do you? Some Greek would have said to a Spartan, some Greek woman would have said to a Spartan woman, you know, what's wrong with you Spartans? Why are you women allowed to speak amongst your men? And then the Spartan woman replies something to the degree of, because only Spartan women give birth to Spartan men. And it's like, that's the attitude that's kind of being put across, you know, and so that's significant as well.
So let me reframe this and sting a little bit, right? So you have the aristocracy, which is basically the founder, right? So that's maybe also why they're founding a city, right? So the foundation is within laws, right? And the laws are made by constraints about the environment versus the constraints about the people in the moment, right? And then they serve a purpose of erecting the city. And then when you have the city erected, right, now they start becoming disconnected, right, and different games start to get played, right, and you get the generation that's disconnected, right, like that's why they have this generational decline, right, and they become disconnected from the reason of the rule, right? That's one of the first things that they say about the democracy, right? Like they don't know why things are the way they are, and so I think that's maybe the way to look at that, and then that's connected to property as well, right? Like what's the property when you're founding a city? Well, you're communing in making the city a success, right? So the property is communal in a fundamental way, right? And when the city is a success, now there can be a division of property, right? It can sustain multiple heads, multiple directions, and then that's the process of degradation can seep in. Yeah, so what do we want to do with this crazy math stuff? I have a couple notes on this. So the interesting thing is that the connection between 6 holding 1, 2, and 3, right? And I wrote in my notes and a little. that's why you got the weak, right? That's how you have Genesis. That's kind of the same pattern there. And that's relating it back to the cycle, right? And I guess I need to go to the cycle, right? Like the circle is representative of a cycle, and then there's this statement that the governments have them, right? And then you need to have a vision of the whole cycle in order to have a judgment upon the cycle, and then there's 6 stages within the cycle. And you can describe a rotation, and I think that's kind of what's happening in the book, right? We're describing the rotation of the cycle of government, but also we're describing the rotation of the cycle of the human soul within that government. And then they had 2 words there, and I think they were referencing back to the last book, right? So he was using the numbers 1, 2, and 3, which is a reference to math, right? And then he's saying involution, and I don't really know what that word means. Does anybody have a sense of what that word means?
Which word again?
Involution.
Where is involution?
I just looked it up. The shrinkage of an organ in old age when inactive. Function, transformation, or operator that is equal to its inverse. That's probably what it is. Which gives the identity when applied to itself. So I don't know.
I see dissolution, but not involution. So
Where are we at?
Well, it's the same. I think involution is then the organic dissolution, the organic word for dissolution. That's I guess what it is. It's 246 B in the end of B. But the period of human birth is comprehended in a number in which the first increments by involution and evolution, right? And then they were making the relationship with involution and squared, right, which would be the field of what was the second field? Arithmetics or something. And then cubed is evolution, right? So evolution would be the description of objects within 3D, right? So he's referencing back to the, well, actually to all the four things that they're supposed to educate people in, right? Because the cycle is the thing that follows from astronomy, right? Because astronomy is the description of the cycles of the universe. So I guess that just like puts everything back into an intelligible frame, at least for me. Then they're talking about 3 intervals and 4 terms of the like waxing and waning numbers make the terms commensurate and agreeable to one another, right? So, yeah, I think he's talking about the harmony between these 4 disciplines, which was the thing that was supposed to show the good as well. So, and then he goes into stuff that I have no idea about, but apparently he's supposing that there's a mathematical equation that can be solved that resolves this issue. And if anybody has some insight on this, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I just kind of glazed over this part,
Same.
which is unfortunate.
Okay, so then where I picked it up again is on degeneration. And the degeneration is in relation to the music and the gymnastics. And this is the way that the aristocracy and the democracy start becoming discordant. And so the degeneration is happening within the level of cultivation, right? So apparently we're not upkeeping our relationship to our foundation, right? And this is connecting it earlier to the 10 plagues, right, where creation is being undone, right? Because these are like the foundations upon which the whole city is built, the music and the gymnastics, right? And those 2 aspects are the ones that are being attacked and then reverberate through the whole system and basically corrupting it. So you have the degeneration of the cultivation of music and gymnastics, and then a generation later, you lose the discernment of the nature of individuals, right? So because you no longer participate in the pattern, you cannot recognize other people's participation in the pattern properly, and now you well, since the aristocracy is putting people at the place where they're best serving, right? You corrupt the assignment of office to people, and that starts degenerating the nature of the city, right? And there were 3 words that were used. The introduction of a dissimilarity, right? So instead of your peers being your peers, you get confusion in there. And then as a consequence of the confusion, you also get inequality. And then you get an irregularity, irregular expression of these things. And then discord occurs, right? Like, so there was a harmonious city, but now we've been putting sand in the wheels. And then we start getting the separation between iron and brass, right, which are the lower tiers. They pursue money, and gold and silver, they are looking for virtue and the establishment tradition, and so they're inattention. And well, another way to say that is like you don't have a shared vision anymore. They're no longer partaking in the city, right? Like a group is partaking in the city and another group is partaking in their individual interests.
Right, but the guardians, right, turn into the enslavers. So they take the people they were protecting and enslave them as the result of this tension.
Yeah, I get that. I think at least.
So it looks like what I'm getting from this is there's a failure in attention. They're failing to attend to, I guess we could say a certain pattern, whatever he's going through with all this math, and basically people become negligent, or in other words, they become sinful because they're failing to attune themselves, and then discord ensues,
Well,
and it just kind of starts.
they do not attend to the foundation, right? There's a foundation upon which everything is built, and they neglect the upkeep of the foundation.
Yeah.
And because there's no upkeep, you cannot attend. Like the attention is physically impossible. Like that's the problem. Like at that point, it's just consequences, right? Like if you haven't learned how to be correctly, like how are you going to be correctly?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it said, yeah, they stopped going to church.
Yeah, effectively, yes. So we ended an intermediate between oligarchy and aristocracy. The suspicion is introduced towards the philosopher class, right? So now the ruling class is no longer believable because like you don't know if they're corrupted or not, right? Like it might be some one of the lower tiers that got onto that position. And then war gets introduced.
Kind of what reminds me of kind of what's happening now with our collapse of institutions. You can't, you're just, everyone's suspicious of the institutions because they can't trust them anymore. And then war is the inevitable result of that, which is terrifying.
Well, I'm the phrase is longer. So the war, like this is my understanding, right? This is not in the text. So war is that by which virtue can be expressed, right? Because like a good commander gets results, right? And so there's a recognition that is true within the war, and so if you cannot see the virtue of the leader, you pick the person that you can see the virtue of.
Well, and I think it's bigger than that, right? The idea of fighting for what you believe in points to your virtue. It's not to say that the thing you're fighting for is virtuous, right? It's to say that you only fight over the things you think are virtuous. Like you're only fighting for virtue ever.
Why else would you? Why else would you stake your life on anything but yourself? Because if you're gonna go stake your life on anything, it has to be something beyond yourself.
Well, it's that's in this condition, yes. But I would argue that later on in the oligarchy, they'd fight for their money or their possessions, right? But, yeah.
Yeah, but those are their values. I mean, that's explicit. It's like, well, and it's whole explicit in this whole thing, right? Like, oh, each of these two races, the iron and the bronze. Well, one worships iron and the other worships bronze, and that causes a split because they're different values. And that's important later on in the democracy, because again, why does the democracy break down? Because it's basically hedonism. Pure democracy is pure hedonism, and therefore you can't have a city because you can't have things in common, and therefore it's not that hard. Like even the math works. It's not difficult to understand why this isn't going to work.
So, seeing the virtue in war or in strife, right, will invite that nature into the city, right? So now the nature of the city starts to change, but the morality that is present will constrain people from owning wealth, right? So there's a constraint that is inherited because the system, well, has its own nature, right? Like it's and so the only way to possess wealth is to possess it through others, right? Like basically through offering all that stuff. And the consequence on the basics is that there's a privileging of gymnastics over music, right? Which would be a loss of the poetic, kinda.
Yes, correct.
And then this is characterized by that contention and ambition are the most prevalent things within that society. And then he's like, well, if we go further, like that's getting way too much into the details. Like, so let's hop over to man. And so the man in this society is pursuing honor and power. And he's presenting or boasting about his armed feats as a right to rule, or maybe feats in conflict, in war, I guess. And then exercise and chase, and like I don't know what word do you have there, Mark? Like, cause
Where are we? Which
549.
particular? 5 which?
49.
49. Which section?
The
In
B-
A?
A, yes.
I mean, I see what you're saying. What's the phrase that you're curious about?
he is that's at the end of the paragraph. He's also a lover of gymnastic exercises and the chase.
The hunt.
Yeah, that's what I thought. The pursuit. So the wanting to attain something. That's the way that I interpret it.
Yeah, that's what a chase is. Yeah, chase, hunt, pursuit. Wound up in
Which is still virtue, right? Because it's requiring something of you. Like it's not you sit in your ivory tower.
Right. It's time, energy, attention, and action.
So I read something along the lines of the Platonic model of the soul, where you have the head, the heart, and the belly. There's something about necessary and unnecessary. I don't remember if it was virtues or desires or something like that. And so the necessary ones were baked into human nature, and the unnecessary ones could be done away with through education and stuff like that. And they mention the word necessary a lot, but I don't know exactly what they're saying here.
That's Epicureanism. That's covered really well in the Wisdom of Hypatia, part of the book that's good. The rest of the book is garbage. Epicureanism and Stoicism parts of that book are excellent. The first third of the book is good. The rest of it is complete fantasy.
Which ones were considered unnecessary, or what sorts of things would be in that bucket?
You want a list? Give me a sec.
Well, I mean, I sorry, I don't mean to distract from the discussion. So I mean, I was just kind of curious.
Well, things that are necessary would be food, and water, right? But unnecessary would be ice cream, right? And then
Gluttony.
there's a
Yeah,
luxury.
there's a whole chart in here, Manuel. Remember?
Yeah, I know. Like I tried to reformulate it because like I didn't like the categories completely that they were using.
Yeah, I remember. That's why I thought you would know off the top of your head. But actually, I think that's what they're getting at in terms of that's what Nick's asking is like what are the higher abstract necessaries and unnecessaries that they're talking about.
No, I think that's literally it, right? Because like ice cream is like an expression of something that's necessary, right? But you don't have to have that specific version of the necessity, right? So it's still fulfilling a role that needs to be fulfilled, but you don't have to fulfill it with that. While like drinking or whatever is. And
Like you can drink water instead of whiskey all day, right?
right. And leisure is also in there, right? Like so you can watch Netflix or you can play sport. Right?
Yeah, they're both forms of leisure, right?
And
Yeah,
then there
that's
is
how.
you can shoot drugs and like that's just completely like,
Right, and I would say that the difference between necessary and unnecessary is actually just the issue of abstraction. So when you're pointing at an abstraction, that's unnecessary.
well, I
Uh,
also think that it's related to your intent,
Mhm.
right? So if I'm participating in this, am I participating in this because I need to or because I want to?
Right.
Yeah, I think that seems to me to be more of what they're at. I mean, they mentioned in the Republic like men and women are drawn towards each other by a kind of necessity, but I mean the reality is obviously you could be a monk or a eunuch or something. It's not literal. It's more like to be a man, you have, certain responsibilities and roles and things. I think that's kind of what they're more after.
Yeah, well, that would be the expansion, and that's where my criticism came in, right? Because now you're inheriting a worldview, right? It's like, okay, like yes, in order to be a type of man, right, things are necessary, right? But now I'm going to do the postmodern move, right? Like what is it like to be a man? Like now you need to give me an argument for why I need to adhere to your version of man. Right, like what's the manly nature that I need to uphold so that I need to make the sacrifice to participate in that, right? Because that's what it is, right? If it's your nature, it's not a sacrifice.
Right.
And
Right.
so
For what it's worth, I was just going to say, I think it's kind of weird that you would separate different expressions of the same desire, like into into formal categories that way, as if they're different desires, right? Like so,
No,
the
they're not.
desire,
They're
the
not.
sexual,
No, they're not different
yeah,
desires. That's the thing.
right,
Right.
right, right,
That's
yeah,
why
yeah,
it's natural versus necessary. So the example in here, which is I think quite good, right? The stomach is not insatiable as most people say. Instead, the opinion that the stomach needs unlimited filling is false. And so he's not saying eating isn't necessary, right? Eating is natural, but eating until you're filled is not necessary, which is correct. Like it's that nuance. It's not saying the desire doesn't exist or classifying the desire. It's saying that when you're aiming at something that isn't sufficient, isn't merely sufficient, right? Is more than sufficient, then you're into the unnecessary. Right. So that what is natural is basically sufficient.
yeah. I think it's for what it's worth. Like I tend to think of in terms of like desires and appetites are part of like being human, right? But what do you do with those, right? How do you express them, right? How do you feed them, right? Like that's the that's where you necessarily start to get into that worldview type thing in terms of what's good and right and appropriate versus what's unnecessary.
Well, I mean, people desire wealth, power, and fame. Are those necessary desires or unnecessary?
Well, I might say the need to feel significant, right? It's
Yeah,
just
but
part of the
that's not
human
what
condition.
but that's
You know?
not what this says, Nick. Like, I know you can just change the
Yeah,
words
yeah.
and fix the problem, but that's the point. The point is there are things like wealth, power, and fame, and they are desires, and they are not necessary desires. And that's the so it's the classification of desires as such. Not all desires are equal, and I think that's true. And there's only 4 classes, so it's not like a big sorting. It's a small sorting. So that's the part of wisdom of Hypatia that's quite good is Epicureanism, and that's where they cover that outline.
Cool.
And I think, right, like you can use words like second nature, but I Van der Klee had this whole thing about natural and what's natural, right? And then the thing that's unnatural is the thing that's imposed by humans, effectively, right? But that's not true, right? Like if I cultivate myself in a way, things become natural to me. Like
Well,
it's
I think if I remember what he was talking about there, Manuel, he wasn't necessarily endorsing that view, but he was saying that is kind of an implicit view in the culture that essentially like anything that man does to the face of the earth, right, is by the popular definition of the term, like we'll categorize that as unnatural, as if humans aren't natural creatures. It's kind of a weird
yeah, but
thing
that's
we do.
not no, but that's not true, right? Because
Oh no,
it's
no, I agree.
no, no,
I
no,
don't
no,
I
no.
don't
Hold
really
on,
follow
hold
what
on.
the
It's natural for a farmer to work his fields.
right. Yeah, I would agree.
All right. So there's maybe the nature is inherited from farmerness or whatever, right? but it's natural for the farmer. Like, and it would be unnatural for him to not do that. Like so.
Well, and so I completely agree, and I thought, and again, maybe I'm thinking of a different thing, but I thought I thought Van der Klee's point is that this is how we talk. We talk as if anything that man does is somehow excluded from the natural category,
Yeah, but that's
right? Because we've
false
got some
because
sort
we
of
don't
romantic
talk
notion.
like
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
Okay, so
And I thought
he
he
was
agreed.
wrong. like
Oh no,
No,
no, no,
he's
no! I thought
no.
he was critiquing something that he didn't agree with. I thought.
no,
Maybe.
that's not what he was doing. He was exploring something that he didn't know how to talk about. Like it's
Oh, okay.
different.
Okay. All right.
Like like we do that all the time. Like we have this word, right? So I've been talking about glory lately because like I know it's important, but like I don't know what glory is. Like I have no clue. Like stuff like that is really hard, and it's like people say something and then the ball gets rolling in your head. Oh, like they're making this association, and you start seeing the form of glory, which is like in some sense the most ineffable thing ever, because like 2 or 3 abstractions out. Right? It's like and but to go back to the natural, right? So it's in the cultivation, and that's why I think it's cultivation, right? Like you cultivate nature. like you don't cultivate the unnatural. So the unnatural is what is imposed, right? And I think that's where Van der Klee made the mistake, right? He's in the materialistic frame, and he's from the materialistic frame is like everything a human does is imposed because cultivation doesn't exist. Like
Right.
that's
'Cause
basic.
that would require responsibility. And the irony here is that again, that outline, which is outlined in 546, is refuted by Plato. He's look, the materialistic frame doesn't work. Things are not just going to unfold magically the way you want because Pythagoras invokes math, which is effectively what he's doing, and geometry and stuff, right? And that's why they get into this discussion that we're in now about uh, I like the justice man and the unjustice one, right? And right? The regimes and the cycles and all that. And so, in other words, if you try to understand the cycles with math, it fails miserably and immediately. And that's why they invoked the muses.
Right, which have an interesting characteristic that they can only be true, which is like what? We'll get to that.
Right. Well, and that's the theme throughout the book. Whenever they run into a problem with the materialist frame or with the mathematical or scientific frame, they say, "Oh, we don't know how to resolve this. Let's invoke a god." Every single time. It's pretty clear. It's amusing too.
So,
I guess real
Back-
And we'll
quick.
declare that the muses say what the muses say is right.
Yep.
Maybe I'll adopt that saying.
which is basically reality is that which dictates truth and not the system. Like, I think that's
Yes.
basically what it is. Daddy, did you?
Well, I haven't finished thinking it through, but you asked, okay, when we're talking about what's necessary, what's unnecessary, what if I make the postmodern relative move? One thing I was thinking about, and this is partially from DC Schindler, but I haven't finished, is when Thrasymachus was introduced the idea of that might makes right, it's actually a relative claim. And so one of the tricks that Socrates does is he finds a way to absolutize the relative claim. So he says something along the line. I don't remember what the argument was, but he made it like 7 arguments. But one of them was like, doesn't your power come from your subordinates? And then I think it was Cleophas sees where Socrates is going and tries to offer, what's his name? I keep forgetting. There's Thrasymachus a lifeline and saying, "Oh, actually, it's only the perception of power." But what that move would Thrasymachus does not take that lifeline because it would make his position vacuous. And what motivates him is he's a sophist. What motivates him is power. So it actually his motivations and the form of the argument that he's making actually constrain and corrupt his rational capacities. So by absolutizing, if you can march back the axioms, eventually you have to run into a wall and absolutize something. Like, what standards are you using? What metrics are you using? So that's one of the tricks you can use. When you say like, otherwise you just end up like you can grant, like, if you want, you have to choose. If you choose consistency, then you're in a powerless position, and then you just become the dude. Like, okay, whatever, bro. That's just your form, man. Like, have fun being a useless. Like you're just useless now.
Right.
But you can be consistent.
No, but hold on. There's a problem here, right? And the problem that I'm pointing at is you can make the negative case, right? But when you say nature, you make a positive case, right? Like, now you're proclaiming a truth.
Well, you're appealing to something outside of yourself that is unconditional to you. Right? Nature is not conditioned upon you. Your perception of nature is conditioned upon you, but nature is not. That's where the closest thing to objective material reality comes from. The problem is it changes all the time. So it's not, it's not of the nature that people wish, right? And then, Danny, the other point about where, say, might make right makes right comes from is there is a deep difference, and the postmoderns obviously are too stupid to make this difference, or at least make it clear, because they're sophists, and sophists are evil, by the way, just so we're all clear on how this works. There's a difference between the potential and the actual, right? And so and this is important, right? This is what we were saying earlier about value. And it's one thing to say, I believe in something. It's another thing to put your life on the line for it. It's one thing to say, I could have these guys go to your house and beat you up. It's another thing entirely to try and make that happen, because it might not happen that way. Like, there are a lot of dead hitmen out there, believe it or not. Like, oh, you came to my house and tried to kill me, but I found you and I killed you first. Like, it's not a guarantee. Just because you're the strongest does not mean you're going to win the fight. And just because you win the fight doesn't mean that you're going to be around much longer to enjoy that victory. That's the Pyrrhic victory. Right? And so there's a great deal of uncertainty in these things. So this is why the models don't work, where people say, oh, the government tells people what to do and they just do it. Observably, that's not happening. It didn't happen anywhere. And it almost never happens. And when it does, it's a ridiculous exception for an unimportantly short period of time, right? And because we don't make that particular differentiation, we press things down to, oh, the leader says something and everybody just does it because the leader's the strongest, and if they don't, he'll beat them up. That never happens. Like, people challenge leaders all the time, and this is Peterson's point about the tyrannical ape chimp gets, torn apart by two lesser chimps. Like, duh. You can't be at the top alone by yourself without support from others. It's never going to work because two people or three people are always going to be stronger than the one person. And it's that negotiation and that subtlety that the top-down power from above people are missing.
And again, right? Like even in Plato, he's sometimes bringing things in, right? It's like, well, this is natural, or like this is so, and I'm like, I don't know about this, right? Like maybe, but also like I wouldn't bet my life on that at all. and so when you say, right, like I don't know what it was, right, but like effectively like you have necessary things that you need to do because of your nature, right, as a man or whatever, right, then you are staking your life on, right, like because now you're conforming, like you that's gonna be you. And like I'm yeah, right, like if you have the Christian answer, right, like, oh, the image of God, like now you have it open-ended again, right, like that's fine, but like if you start closing that stuff up, then you better be damn careful with what you're doing. Okay.
So it is 11 o'clock. Wanted to point that out.
No, it's 6.
No, it's noon.
We have arrived at the hour.
Yeah, y'all are all wrong. It's 9.
Yeah, we want to land the plane, or do we want? Yeah, I have a couple more lines. Finish.
Well, we
the
started late,
democracy.
so I think we should give it another 20 minutes.
Okay. So these democracy people, they will despise riches, right? 'Cause dishonorable, but they will grow into them as a cause of inevitability, because money is in some sense what makes the world move, right? And also if you're trying to attain something, right, like if you're not trying to attain wealth with what you're trying to attain, then yeah, you either become irrelevant or someone else is going to surpass you, probably, right? Which is probably kind of the same thing. And then the cause of this was given is the lacking of philosophy with music to temper, right? So interesting that there's a connection with temperance to music. I don't know if we made that earlier. So the philosophy is related to the top of the hierarchy, right? What was the word? Was it philosophy? Yeah, that was the virtue, right? Or was it wisdom? Wisdom was the virtue, right? So now there's a corruption of the top and of the bottom, right? Where previously it was only a corruption of the bottom, and now this gets into the story of the father, and where you inherit your principles from, basically. So it was an interesting description of the father. I don't know what made it be that way, but what I took out of it is that the father lacks participation, but he's still acting entitled, which is like maybe a problem that we see nowadays a lot. People who don't participate but act entitled. And then it's going to the feminine, right, to the mother. And she's complaining about the lack of status. She becomes in disrepute due to the lack of the participation, and then she complains, right? So this is kind of like the corruption coming from the feminine again. And discrediting the exemplary nature of the father. And the servants participate in that. And so it's interesting that these two motivations, they're yearning back towards the old ideal. They're trying to re-manifest what they think would be the right way for the household to operate. But then, well, I'll just go through this thing. So the son now gets called upon to uphold the law that the father cannot uphold. But the father still holds the ideal in the education, right? So the perception is that the father isn't holding on to the ideal, but he is, and that which gets presented as holding on to the ideal is actually that which corrupts. And so the whole world is telling a different story than the thing that the father is imparting. And this introduces a regression towards a divided nature, and that invites arrogance and ambition within the child. So that's the first step, right? Arrogance and ambition, pride comes before the fall. And yeah, I maybe we should go through the example a little bit more. Slowly. So he is often the young son of a brave father who dwells in an ill-governed city, of which he declines the honors and office, and will not go to law or exert himself in any way, but is ready to waive his rights in order that he may escape trouble. So there's a dissociation there happening. And how does the son come into being? The character of the son begins to develop when he hears his mother complaining. So, what do you guys think about this description of the father? Like, because basically the implication is that if you're virtuous, you don't want to participate in the corruption. You live hidden.
Yeah, that's. I mean, that's correct. Like, I don't. What do you mean? Like, where's the confusion? I think that's necessarily correct. Right. He's not involving himself. Right? But I think also it points to the non-involvement. He's also not doing the right thing, and therefore he's not courageous. That is true. And also the person that points out the truth to the son is the mother. All of that is kind of significant.
So when she observes that he in himself, whilst he treats her with very considerable indifference. There's, I guess that's the loss of, yeah, like there's a dissociation there.
Yeah, but at some point you can't read too deeply into the ridiculous, because this is he's setting very harsh, ridiculous, deliberately ridiculous constraints, right, on purpose, and that's fine. That's what he's doing, setting very harsh, ridiculous constraints on purpose to exemplify something. So you don't want to read too deeply into it, because it's plain at that point. It's just saying when this happens, the view of what happened is this. Yeah, that's true. It's not a magic trick. It's not like, oh, if you read into the psychological significance. No, it's no need.
So to help Danny, while his father is watering and nourishing the rational principle in his soul, the others are encouraging the passionate and the appetitive. And he, being not originally of bad nature, but having kept bad company, is at last brought by their joint influence to a middle point. So this is referencing back to the people who couldn't make it to be philosopher kings because they didn't have the right environment.
Well, I don't think it's referencing back to anything. I mean, I think that's where people make the mistake. The book isn't referencing back. It's creating different cities. And it's just showing you that that pattern exists in all those cities. You don't need philosopher king. The pattern's still there. You don't need classes the way that's outlined in the cave. That pattern's still there. Like the pattern doesn't go away. They're not connected. They don't have to be connected. They're just expressions of the pattern. And they're different expressions. And like this is why people are getting wrapped up in the book, because they're not understanding the pattern. The point of this is to express the pattern. And it's not to link the books together. That's why they're separate books. They're not linked together. They keep rebuilding the city from scratch and showing that those patterns are still there. No matter how you build the city, these patterns occur. And the fact that you can draw a parallel to other cities is irrelevant. It just exemplifies the pattern. And that's where people get confused on the interpretation.
So yeah, in my notes we go to oligarchy. So I think we should get our final comments in and start from there. Nothing?
Nothing about what?
No comments? No.
I mean, the only thing that I can say is just what the text says, which is that we're moving away from the rational principle of the soul, and part of it's because of the influence of company. And this motherly figure is obviously not an ideal one. Now, whether it's because of like the reason for that is not, it doesn't matter. It's just that when you hang out with company that is fallen, it's, it can rub off on you. I mean, that's what's happening in the story here. Whether it's her parent or whether the husband's not, being strong, it doesn't matter. Like, I just don't know.
The thing,
But
this is something that we talk about all the time. The things are implemented firstly through the feminine. That's how they come into being, whether they're good or bad, right? The feminine gestates. That's why it starts first with the mother complaining that her husband was insulted and she's embarrassed, and she's bringing things down to the level of honor as opposed to virtue and goodness.
Right, and she's recognizing the loss of, I guess, justice.
What? Oh,
Yeah, that's
Well,
that's what
I
she's
think that,
reacting to, right?
well, I think someone might say something that's offensive to the father and thus the family, right? And she feels dishonored, and she's and the reason that the father might not rebuke that other person is because he's not primarily concerned with honor. He's primarily concerned with virtue uh and goodness, right? But the mother is more concerned with honor. So she enlists the son to go out and kind of restructure himself
I
to
don't.
where
I
Yeah,
don't think it's honor.
I don't think that's right. Like, I think this is the problem that the book talks about, right? When you bring it down to the level of the family, it doesn't work. You can't talk about honor for a family. You can't talk about justice for a family. You can't do it. It doesn't work. It creates all these problems, right? When you don't have a sense for the justice at the layer of the city or honor at the layer of a city, everything breaks. It's still pointing higher. Everything points higher. So it's not honor as such. It's honor for the oligarchs, right? It's or the people who are, you know,
yeah, but the
were
family's a
oligarchs.
microcosm of the city and of the world. And by looking
Yeah,
at the family,
but I don't
Yep,
think
but
the word cares about honor. Like that's not a feminine quality. Like
th-
sorry, like she
there's
cares
a
about
the
justice.
feminine is
there's a bigger issue. You can't do that scaling ever. Yes, it's fractal. You can't scale it. You can't draw that comparison. This is the point of the whole text. You cannot draw that comparison. That comparison is not available for you to draw because it doesn't work. In other words, what honor means in the context of an individual, in a family, and in a city are completely different things. And they conflict. That's what this chapter is about, is that there's, because things at the top conflict with the family level, and because the family level conflicts with the individual level, and because of time, in other words, we didn't start with a democracy, all right? The things at the lower level or the things that are newer see the world differently from the things that have experience, right?
Mhm.
Or the things at the top. In other words, what is just for the city is not necessarily just for the individual or the family. And that's where the problem is that there is always this friction and this change
right.
and this flipping as the result of that.
The point that I'm making is that they're looking at the family unit and seeing how the highest the highest value in the family unit is going from goodness to honor, and that's it. That is the image of how that's changing.
Mm,
It starts out with
uh,
something
I,
like the wife being embarrassed or something.
But it
no,
doesn't,
I don't think that actually happened. Like
I,
I,
yeah.
but that's why I was going into the inquiry of what's our father, right? Because I don't think he's turned away from goodness, at least not the way that he's described there. Like, so he might be impotent. Like that might be
No, I
the
don't think
case.
that he did either. But for whatever reason, it's
Well,
still kind
then,
of a mystery why it happens. But he's just analyzing the change and how the change happens.
but it is more, right? Because if the father is acting virtuously, then what the mother is doing is unjust.
Right.
Perhaps, but I mean, the thing is, you can't. It's hard. You can't reduce the injustice to one part of the family, but this is
No,
nonetheless how it's
you
being.
can. Like, why not?
Well, you don't. I mean, maybe the. I don't. I mean,
Like
maybe so.
if I'm doing God's will and someone is chastising me for doing God's will, then that person is wrong. I'm sorry. Like
I guess, yeah. I mean, it doesn't really matter, but
Yeah,
it's like,
the point is that they're unequally yoked. So the mother complains that the husband has no place in government. I know plenty of women, power couples, hippie couples who don't complain about status. But it also says the father treats her with considerable indifference, meaning, hey, I'm busy doing God's work. I'm going to continue on my path. Like there's a middle ground where you have to balance your
Right.
endeavors outside of you with yourself. So it doesn't matter whether there's blood on one side or both side. Point is that she gets annoyed and says, and then she starts talking to her son and says, "Your father's half a man, very disrespectful, too easygoing." Like this is just now it's just a complete mess. And then adding to all the other complaints about her ill treatment, oh, wham, a victim, very common, which women are so fond of rehearsing. But yeah, I mean, I think the point is that they're not equally yoked. Like you can be a power couple and that can work, but you've just got to be oriented towards the same thing.
I think there's also something else, like the, I mean, and this is a distinction between men and women at some level. But the C.S. Lewis has this. He says at one point, he says, if you run over your neighbor's dog, right, who would you rather talk to, the mom or the lady of the house, or the man, right? And there's something about, you know, part of my role as being a dad and a father in a house, right, is to try and keep the peace, and that doesn't necessarily mean going and fighting every time, you know, maybe every time my wife thinks I should be offended, you know, and there are times when she's been offended that I'm too easygoing in her eyes, right? But there's other you know, I've got purpose for doing that, right? But yeah, I don't know. This just seems like a men versus women trope at some level.
Well, the point that I wanted to talk about is like this only occurred because the system wasn't functioning properly, right? So then he says they're not equally yoked. Like maybe that wouldn't have gotten expression if the city was still functioning correct.
Right.
Right. Okay. Yeah. It's what he's saying here is that this is it's not saying the city is causing the family or the family is causing the city. All these are happening. He's not linking it to one
No.
mechanical.
This is literally the statement that the city corrupts first.
Right. He is linking it. He says starting from corrupt city. And then he's going to what might be impotent man, right? And then he's going to spiteful wife, right? Which causes corrupt child. In other words, top affects the bottom. And that causes the bottom to affect the top later. And it's the later that everybody gets confused about.
And to be fair, right, the bottom affected the top first by not practicing virtue, right, or whatever, like the harmonical music
Can we
thing.
say something like in the corrupt city that he's talking about, like you get ahead by petty status seeking, right? And for somebody to not participate in that, it's, you know, it's discordant in that system, right?
Yes, that's probably why the father is associated, because he's not participating in what's happened.
Yeah. What it says here is a good father. Yeah, and he's a son of a good father who lives in a city that isn't well governed, who avoids honors, office lawsuits, and all such meddling in other people's affairs. So the city is falling, right? And the wife, the mother, is resentful towards the father and not participating in this fallen city.
And basically, right, like if you're in a principality, right, and the principality corrupts, like what's right action, right? Like if you're a good person, like you don't go with the corruption, but like what's the other option? And apparently there's no place to sacrifice yourself. That's implicit, which might be true. Like I don't know.
I think this is just a picture of what he was saying with the democracies. When you have your highest value is honor, and you neglect the muses, you end up in a situation. We're moving towards the love of money oligarchy, and this is he's painting a picture of. Here's an example of a husband and wife that have problems, and here's an example of it because they have different values. Maybe the husband is only cares about honor, but he's not harmonious with, he's not balanced in other areas of his life. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. The point is that the muses have been neglected and now there's problems.
The what
You're
has
right on
been
that.
neglected?
The muses. The good.
Yeah.
No,
The truth.
yeah, I don't like. Yeah, I don't. I think he's actually making a logically necessary argument.
Which is what?
Well, if the city is corrupt and the person in the city isn't corrupt, then it's gonna introduce discord within the household, like in the layer
It's
down.
gonna- Yeah, no, yeah, but it's a bigger issue again.
No, you can
corrupt
live in a corrupt
city-
world without having a
No,
corrupt your
but
family.
that's not the issue. A corrupt city corrupts the corrupt family, right? Or the misoriented family, because he's misoriented. He's not fighting the badness, right? And so, yeah, the corruption spreads is the point here. That's the only point. You're reading too far into this. He's making very silly false dichotomies on purpose, right? He's saying the mother will act this way. That's not apparent at all, and it's not common. So no, that's not true, right? And then he's saying, and then the son will respond this way. Again, that's not true. It's not common. It's not apparent, right? And
No, no, no.
I mean, the whole
I'm
outline,
just
every
saying,
part
like,
of it is wrong.
if you take like 50 of these families, then this will happen in one of the 50. Like, I think
Okay,
that's the
but
point.
again, it's not talking about what will happen because it's absurd. Talking about the principle of the pattern that the corruption of the city will corrupt the family unit. Corruption of the family unit will corrupt the individual. That's what this says. That is correct. That is a pattern throughout the book, right? Again, or throughout the entire text, throughout all the books. That is part of the problem, is that we're co-locating the pattern in the wrong place. The pattern is everywhere in every one of the books of the text. That pattern is here. Again, the top affects the bottom affects the top. Get over it.
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't matter how, it's just saying that that is true. And it doesn't matter that there's corruption at every layer. It's just saying that whether there's corruption at every layer or not, that impact is apparent.
Yeah,
But
that's
he's
what I was
also
trying to say.
stating the nature of the impact. Like
All right,
he's
can we
saying that
land
there's a
the plane?
specific expression of the impact, not because it's going in a cycle, like, and that's the point.
Yeah,
Like
he's not talking about a specific expression to say that it exists. He's talking about a specific expression to exemplify the pattern. And again, that's throughout
Yeah.
the text. He's not saying Plato's
Mhm.
cave exists or Plato's den exists. He's saying this pattern exists. Here's one way to look at it. It is the same
Yeah.
thing. And that's fine. Like there's nothing
Yeah,
you don't
he's
have
just
to read deep psychological truths into this. They're not there.
he's identifying a pattern or principle and using stories to express that principle.
Absurd stories on purpose to say,
Yeah,
don't read
that's
into this. I'm just showing you the way in which this happens. And oh, by the way, isn't this funny? Because everybody's actually laughing about all this the whole way through.
it's the same thing we do with soups and spoons and stuff in our little absurd hypothetical experiments. Soups and spoons and cabins and woods, and I think we did ice creams and spoons one time. I gotta take off, guys. Are we gonna do 2 parts for book 8?
Apparently, we didn't get very
Okay.
far. I thought
Okay.
we were going to breeze through this, so I'm glad I didn't try to finish it because I just didn't wake up
Okay.
early enough to finish the book.
I figured 8 would go by 8, 9, and 10 would go by a little bit faster than 7. 7 was about a month and a half or 2 months.
Well,
So,
seven's a bear for lots of reasons. Yeah, I
yeah.
thought we'd breeze through this, but we did not. That's okay. It's going to be good. The second half, hopefully next week.
Okay. Thanks, guys. Take care.
Easy.
See you. So, yeah, let's land the plane then. Remember attention. Remember the salient bits. Try and integrate them in your life. Set an intention for the week. And I'll see you guys after the reflection.